Hello and welcome back to the Oldfield Podcast. This is episode 3, Forecasting and Cash Flow. My name's Harry Cook and I'm joined by Angus Brewer, who's a consulting partner here at Oldfield Advisory.
Yeah, so in the previous episodes, we've covered some broader principles around how to manage situations financially in more uncertain times with rising costs and cash flow pressures, and some budgeting and forecasting and break even. And we've also covered what to do when rising cost and how we pass those on to customers, how we protect our margins.
Absolutely. And I think there's this old saying that many of our viewers might have heard before, turnover is vanity, profit is sanity, and cash is king. Ultimately, your cash flow and your forecasting is imperative for the continuity and the growth of your business. And today we're going to deep dive into what makes that possible.
So, Harry, sometimes you see it and the business might be profitable, but they're running out of cash. That can happen, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen it before. Unfortunately, when you're looking at things like paying creditors, if you're a business that holds stock and maybe imports your stock, there's obviously a time lag between paying an invoice and actually receiving your goods, and then you're talking about selling that stock on and a full potential sales process to actually offload that stock, and then obviously your debtors are paying you on an agreed timescale. So there is that period of uncertainty, and then you look at other things that come into the equation, such as submitting your payroll, other cash considerations within a business. And yeah, it's fair to say that there can be gaps and there can be challenging times with cash.
Yeah, managing cash is just so important, and as I say, you can be profitable, but some of those aspects can really have an impact from a cash flow perspective. And I think that's one thing, but we also talked about in a previous episode a little bit around kind of the difference between a budget and a forecast. Do you want to just kind of recap on that just for context for this?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, obviously we know relatively what a budget is. You set your budgets at the start of the year, and that's in a sense what we're setting out to achieve. Obviously your forecast, where it's slightly different, you forecasts are more of a rolling thing throughout the year that sort of adapts and roll with the punches of business. And forecasts should be updated. We should be, as we say, keeping a finger on the pulse at all times, whether that's on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis. But having a yearly budget, you might say it could be at times a little bit rigid in terms of what the business needs at any given point. So I think it's incredibly important that we're reviewing forecasts more regularly than budgets. And I suppose the forecast in a way is almost like the moving parts behind a budget.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on, and yeah, exactly right. So, our aim is for the forecast to ultimately achieve that budget or exceed it, ultimately by the time the year is finished. But when things are changing, things are rolling around a little bit as we go through, the forecast becomes your friend, because that's actually driving or telling you what's going to be happening based on, today and some of the things you can predict into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talk about, the importance of setting a budget at the start of the year. And when we're talking about, cash flow specifically, what's the importance of having, more of a quarterly or a 13-week view of your cash flow?
Yeah. So the way that we would approach it, or like to approach the whole exercise, is to, like you said, beginning of the year, set out the budget. If you can underpin that budget by a kind of a monthly view of cash flow, it gives you a bit of a steer to know that this plan kind of is going to work, and we know where some tight spots are. However, then when you get into the nitty gritty and you're running the business day on day, week on week, it becomes even then more important, a tool that you need to embed. Every business needs to try and embed into their business, in terms of how they run it, is just managing that cash flow week by week, because in practice, weeks 1 to 3 of the month might be different to the final week where you've got your wages to pay. And then you come into the next month, which might be week 7 or 8, and you've got a VAT to pay, and then you've got a tax bill, and you've got a container coming in that needs to be paid, et cetera, et cetera. So there's the overall view of cash flow, but then you've got to then try and distill that down sort of week on week, just so that at the end of the day, the only main reason for it is obviously if there's any tight spots, you're aware of that ahead of time, so you can kind of plan for it and manipulate accordingly, whether it might be some slight tweaking to the timings of payments just to make things work. Obviously, worst case scenario, you need to know if you need to arrange any facilities, and you're going to give you a bit of window for that. But also, it's so you're not caught short as well, because You don't want, as a business owner, you don't want to sort of, maybe log on to your banking and suddenly find that cash flow, your cash that you thought you had in the bank last week is no longer there. Or you go past the finance team and the one of the person say we can't make the payments because there's not cash in there. So you want to avoid those situations because you're embedded into that, keeping a handle on it week on week, if that makes sense, and keep it rolling as well. So it's not just a once-off exercise.
Yeah. No, absolutely. No, it's really important. And I suppose, from an importing standpoint, we discussed a couple of the intricacies there with, importing stock in and, the cash flow challenges that can come up with that. How does it vary with a project-based business when you're looking at cash flow forecasting with sort of longer project lengths and timescales?
Yeah, well, it's really important, isn't it? And I guess with a project-based business, it is you've got a lot of factors, and sometimes like time lags or time length of projects can make a big difference to that. And how to ensure a project-based business is kind of in positive cash flow as the project goes forward is obviously really the paramount to how the business will kind of survive and ultimately thrive, if that makes sense. I guess, you've got some of the same factors though, in terms of, you're buying materials and all of a sudden, I don't know, sometimes you might import, other times more locally sourced, but ultimately you've got to be in awareness of what those new costs are as well, because with costs maybe going up due to inflation, due to shipping delays, etc. You've just got to be clear as to when you're paying for stuff in relation to what ends up being on site, or when you actually end up getting the payment from the customer. The other thing is just to be, again, down to project managers being all over, understanding where the site's going, and if there's any delays on site by other contractors and stuff, you want to avoid a situation where you're forward ordering a whole load of materials ending up, you've either got to get the supplier to hold them, or you've got to get it on site, but you can't actually deliver it into actual installation or execution of that work, and therefore you can't get paid by the customer. So project management is really key. Clear, accurate reporting on margins and current cost basis per project. By project is very important. Can't just blanket it. It's got to be looked at by project. And then ideally, at least some of the big projects, we always recommend in a project-based business, you've got, you might have a few larger projects, is you actually forecast your cash ins and outs on each project. It might feel like a daunting kind of a process, but if you are concerned about volatility of things in today's climate, and you've got some larger projects going through, we'd strongly recommend that the finance team or the along with the project managers kind of actually just scope out project by project what's actually going to happen, so that and then roll it up so you know what the overall impact's going to be.
So Angus, is there any particular experiences that sort of come to mind of maybe an owner managed business that you've worked with over the years that maybe didn't have a handle on their cash flow forecast like they should have done?
Yeah, I guess you come across many over the years, but I think there is one that actually stands out. Actually, I can picture there's a business that came to us, and they had some challenges in trying to get a handle on what their financial position really was, and had some challenges with their systems, etc. Anyway, piece of work, managed to get some financial, some reports down the management accounts. I remember them being sent to me for review. I was kind of around lunchtime, and I just remember reading this set of accounts, and the profit and loss was one thing, but then I went to the balance sheet, and I looked at it for a little bit, and it suddenly dawned on me that this was going to create some real challenges. And I remember going for a walk and trying to think about what we would need to do to try and solve that. And I suppose the point there is that without proper, decent management information, there will be things where all of a sudden things will trip up, won't they? If you like. And in this case, it was a real challenge. I mean, the business went through a very, very, very tough patch in terms of cash flow. We helped them navigate it and made some changes, and they had to drastically cut a few things in order to survive. But the point is that was a balance sheet that told us that it wasn't the P&L, and they didn't have a cash flow forecast. But there's a certain amount that in that financial information that told us that story that said there was going to be a real problem there. That makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does absolutely. And what were some of the you talk about obviously a P&L and a balance sheet, but then there's a lot of key ratios that you don't necessarily pick up from a set of management accounts or a balance sheet. What were some of the key ratios that you sort of looked at that helped specifically understand exactly where that business was, but then also what we needed to do to get them back on track?
Yeah. Well, in that case, it was actually, as probably just looking at the numbers on the balance sheet, you could basically see that there was absolutely no way they were going to be able to pay their liabilities that were coming due. But ahead of that, had they been having management information, there would have been, it was because of the stock. They were massively ordering stock and racking up the supply bills. And of course, at some point they need to be paid.
Absolutely.
So if you had good management accounts every month on a timely way, things like stock days, making sure that's not going up, debtor days, creditor days. And also, I would say review the balance sheet. But if you're a busy business owner, at least managing those three working capital and stock, debtors and creditors, which roll up to a bit of a working capital cash conversion cycle. And if that keeps blowing out and extending, then although you might not be under cash flow pressure immediately, it will come.
Absolutely. That's good.
So if we're a business owner, listen to this series and we're thinking about this idea of forecasting, idea of scenario planning, and kind of know that we need it, but we're struggling to get there on it. What would you say to help?
Yeah, really good question. I suppose my first point would be, you're not alone. It's a common thing that we see. It comes up a lot. And I think the key point from my perspective would be, don't leave it too late. Whether you've got some in-house capability in terms of your finance function, we help a lot of businesses, partner businesses with, supporting them to, upskill or train their in-house capability to actually take a bit more ownership of the cash flow forecasting. Then on the flip side of that, if you haven't necessarily got the in-house capability in the here and now to do it, we help a lot of partner businesses again with actually taking a bit more ownership of their cash flow forecasting, and that's something we're sort of well au fait with doing. So I would just say, don't leave it too late, and feel free to reach out if you feel that it's an area that you could be sharper in.
Absolutely. And again, talking about management reporting as well. Again, if you haven't got those visibility of that, again, that's something you need, isn't it? Part of the prerequisite to this. And also, if you're not sure in relation to what good looks like or what some of these numbers are, then you might need someone, at least initially, to kind of actually guide you and steer you on what those numbers are. So having regular meetings with an advisor who can point out those things to make sure, again, like you say, just don't want to be caught short and end up in the more challenging situation. It's more about, are we on track with a plan and what can we do to keep moving forward, keep progressing? If that makes sense.
Yeah. Great advice, Angus.
So Harry, give us your key takeaways from this episode.
Yeah, so for me, it's absolutely imperative to be getting sort of good, timely, accurate management reporting, but then also making sure that you're getting, timely and accurate balance sheet and having a full review of that, but then also reviewing some of the key metrics and ratios, that should really be sitting alongside your management reporting and your balance sheet to make sure that you're reviewing the holistic picture of the business and not just the P&L. How about yourself, Angus? What's your key takeaway from today?
I think my key takeaway is if you haven't got started with forecasting, get started. And if you need help, reach out to someone who can help. But the idea of having a forecast, not just on the profit and loss, as you've been saying, but a forecast on your cash flow, and whether that's month by month as a beginning, and then ultimately we need to be embedding that the idea of a rolling 13-week cash flow forecast into the business, whatever size business in a way, and whatever business model, having that controlling mechanism in the business is just a way of actually just managing your business and making sure you stay on top of things. Absolutely.
It's really good. And from myself and Angus, we'd like to sincerely say thank you to our viewing audience for joining us in episode 3. We've got a really exciting episode planned for episode 4, so we look forward to welcoming you back then.